They didn't scream. That was the first unsettling part. When 90% of humanity died, it was mostly quiet. No cinematic wails, no dramatic collapses in public squares. Just people, gone, like the Wi-Fi during a firmware update you forgot to schedule. Welcome to What If Horizons, where we speculate about the wild, the weird, and the woefully unprepared. Today's question: what if a virus, silent, swift, and ruthlessly efficient, wiped out 90% of the global population? Yes, that includes your ex, your barista, and probably whoever's managing your group chat. Let's imagine the unimaginable. First, let's talk logistics. A virus killing that many people isn't just an epidemiological nightmare. It's a paperwork apocalypse. Most governments would collapse before they had time to design a terrifying color-coded chart. The few that remained would be run by whoever had the keys to the bunker, a can of beans, and basic Excel skills. Hospitals? Overrun. Cemeteries? Full by Tuesday. Social media? Still somehow active, mostly with bots pretending to be influencers offering end-of-world detox smoothies. No, Karen, turmeric won't save you from hemorrhagic gigaflu. 27. But thanks for the affiliate link. Cities would empty out faster than a vegan buffet at a barbecue convention. Traffic jams would clear for the first time in recorded history, mostly because no one was left to drive. And you, dear survivor, you're suddenly the main character. Hope you like talking to yourself, because your therapist, your dog walker, and your gym crush didn't make it. But here's the really uncomfortable bit. Nature would cheer. Seriously, with 90% of humans gone, the Earth would have its best spa day in centuries. Carbon emissions would plummet. Rivers would run clear. Dolphins might finally return your texts. The planet would shrug off its burden and get back to doing what it does best, spinning in existential indifference. Meanwhile, the remaining 10% would be figuring out how to microwave a can of beans without setting the safe house on fire. Civilization wouldn't exactly rebuild. It would sort of limp forward, powered by sarcasm, solar panels, and expired granola bars. The new currency? Probably toilet paper, still sealed. And then there's the cultural fallout. With most of the population gone, TikTok dances would be replaced by interpretive monologues about the apocalypse. No one would know how to use the bank app. The Mona Lisa would hang in someone's basement next to their bike and a taxidermy squirrel they named Greg. In short, society wouldn't reset, it would unravel. Slowly, silently, with an awkward soundtrack of looted iPods playing Don't Stop Believin' on loop. But let's pause here, before things get too dusty. This is only the beginning. Stick with me, and we'll explore how humanity might adapt, survive, and inevitably do something incredibly dumb, because that, more than anything, is our true legacy. The thing about surviving the end of the world is that no one really gives you a user manual. One day you're ordering overpriced lattes, the next you're figuring out whether expired dog food is technically edible. Spoiler alert, it is, but only if you pretend it's rustic pate and avoid eye contact with the can. With most of humanity gone, infrastructure didn't collapse so much as it quietly gave up. Power grids flickered inside. Satellites drifted without purpose. The internet sputtered like a nervous child at a spelling bee, eventually blinking out in a final digital hiccup. And just like that, humanity was offline. Literally and metaphorically. The 10% left behind, they weren't heroes. They were awkward, confused, often deeply average individuals who had somehow not died because of sheer luck, social anxiety, or an inexplicable tendency to avoid handshakes. No chosen ones. No doomsday prophets. Just Carl, who worked in IT and accidentally quarantined himself with 800 cans of chili and a stack of 1999 Reader's Digest magazines. At first, people tried to uphold the old ways. A few survivors arranged Zoom calls to organize communities, forgetting that bandwidth was now a myth. Others insisted on keeping calendars, crossing out the days with solemn pens, as if knowing it was Thursday helped when the nearest functioning toilet was 3 miles away and guarded by a particularly territorial raccoon. Religions evolved quickly. Some began worshiping the last vending machine with working lights. Others formed cults around YouTube survival videos, believing in the divine wisdom of a shirtless man named Chad who once taught viewers how to start a fire with a battery and a chewing gum wrapper. Statues of Chad were erected out of scrap metal and bath loofahs. Language also changed. Without spellcheck or Google, grammar died a tragic, unmourned death. New phrases emerged. Doomer noon referred to the moment in the day when existential dread hit hardest. Snacksident meant eating your year's supply of M&Ms in a single sitting. And Zoomghosted referred to the emotional trauma of waiting in a meeting room for people who were, well, extremely dead. But if there was one universal truth that remained, it was this: humans will always find a way to be ridiculous. In the ruins of malls and tech campuses, people held fashion shows wearing curtains and bicycle helmets, because nothing says resilience like a post-apocalyptic runway strut. One commune in Oregon established the first annual mock Oscars, awarding Best Scream during collapse and most creative use of duct tape. Loneliness, of course, became the real virus. It spread silently, infecting the survivors with a gnawing sense that perhaps the human experiment had finally timed out. But even that despair came with its own brand of dark humor. What did one survivor say to the empty supermarket? One man asked aloud in a dusty aisle. "Checkout's open," he answered himself, and laughed for 10 minutes straight. So the world kept spinning, slowly repopulated by the resilient, the weird, and the clinically unbothered. The survivors weren't rebuilding civilization, they were remixing it, one bizarre, duct tape day at a time. And this, dear listener, is where it starts getting weird. Because the virus may have erased most of humanity, but what it left behind might just be stranger than what came before. At some point, the silence became suspicious. Cities stood like motionless film sets, too pristine for comfort, as if the whole planet had been vacuum sealed by some cosmic janitor. Grass poked through highways, deer wandered into Starbucks, and pigeons reclaimed public squares with all the dignity of squatters who'd finally won a centuries-long legal battle. But the eeriest part? The library stayed quiet. Not because there were no visitors, but because no one needed to whisper anymore. And then came the bureaucrats. No, not the original ones. They'd all gone wherever former policy advisors go when there's no one left to ignore their memos. These were the new bureaucrats, survivors with clipboards made from scavenged pizza boxes, assigning roles, hoarding pens, and bringing back meetings. Because even in the smoking wreckage of society, someone always thinks we need a committee, some organized bartering systems. One group in post-virus Stockholm tried to establish a currency based on socks. Another in Kansas insisted Twinkies were the new gold standard. Problems arose when someone tried to buy a bicycle with 2 left socks and a half-eaten ho-ho. The economy collapsed again in under 3 hours. Historians of the future would call it the Second Great Depression of poorly thought-out ideas. In what used to be France, a group of wine enthusiasts declared themselves the Republic of Pinot Noir. Their national anthem was just 30 seconds of someone loudly slurping rose. They had no government, just a rotating wine czar whose only job was to taste everything. Surprisingly, their crime rate was 0, unless you count passive-aggressively recorking someone else's bottle. Elsewhere, strange philosophies took root. Some survivors believed the virus was nature's reset button, a divine control plus alt plus delete. Others believed the planet was being terraformed by hyper-intelligent fungi, and their leader wore a large mushroom hat made from papier-mâché and misplaced confidence. Still, others believed nothing at all and just wanted a decent sandwich. Pets, freed from the leash of humanity, adapted quickly. Dogs formed roaming packs, elected charismatic golden retrievers as leaders, and raided pantries with shocking coordination. Cats didn't notice anything had changed and continued their lifelong mission to knock over every glass of water on Earth. Parrots, however, began giving lectures in abandoned lecture halls, mostly repeating the phrase, "Who's a clever boy?" in increasingly aggressive tones. Human interaction, once a daily nuisance, became a precious commodity. Survivors held awkward, overly intense conversations with anyone they met, often starting with, "Hi. Please don't be imaginary." Handshakes returned, hesitantly. Hugs were offered like Olympic medals. And eye contact became a weird kind of power move, either comforting or deeply unsettling, depending on the context and how many teeth the person had left. But not everyone welcomed the return of others. Some had grown too used to solitude, to the purity of silence, the freedom of pantslessness. Recluses flourished. One man in Nova Scotia declared his garage a sovereign nation and threatened war on anyone who knocked. He eventually ran out of batteries and had to surrender to a family of mildly sarcastic teenagers who exchanged him for peanut butter. As weeks became months, and months bled into the awkward timelessness of calendar-less survival, the question slowly shifted. It wasn't what now anymore. It became, what if this is it? What if the future wasn't a return, but a reroute? A sideways leap into something messier, sillier, and strangely liberating? After all, with no corporations, no queues, and no HOA complaints, humanity had its first real chance at starting fresh. The problem, of course, is that humans are terrible at starting fresh. They're too busy trying to reinvent the microwave using coconuts and misplaced ambition. But don't worry, it's only going to get worse and funnier from here. By the 4th month of the great human absence, the Earth had settled into its post-people groove like an introvert finally getting the house to itself. Skyscrapers stood as gleaming monuments to a species that once believed meetings were a productive use of time. Abandoned Teslas dotted roads like expensive paperweights. Self-checkout kiosks blinked patiently, still waiting for someone to weigh their bananas. But let's not romanticize the apocalypse. Yes, dolphins swam up the Hudson and birds nested in Times Square. Yes, the air was so clean you could smell your own thoughts. But for the remaining humans, life was less Eden and more extended camping trip with a slowly dwindling snack supply. Civilization hadn't ended in fire or ice. It had ended in a very long, very awkward silence. Those who survived began to sort themselves into 3 broad categories: the builders, the bunkers, and the blissfully unaware. The builders were those who couldn't sit still. They immediately got to work reconstructing society from the shattered Lego set of the old world. They roamed empty suburbs with scavenged toolkits and vague dreams of utopia. These were the types who wrote manifestos on cereal boxes and tried to establish rules like no loud music after 9 p.m., even though the nearest neighbor was a moose. Some formed micro-governments. One group in former Denver rebranded themselves as the Unified People's Collective of Rebooted Civilization, but mostly just argued over who got to sit in the old city council chamber. Another group built a functioning town out of shipping containers and named it Second Chanceville. Their motto was do better, but with Wi-Fi, which was aspirational, considering their best internet came from an old satellite dish propped up by duct tape and desperate hope. Then there were the bunkers. These were the doomsday preppers who had waited their whole lives for this moment and were now terribly disappointed by the lack of zombies. They hoarded canned goods like dragons, fortified their basements with homemade traps, and distrusted literally everyone, including their own reflections. Ironically, the bunkers were often the most poorly adjusted. Without an enemy to fight or a government to scorn, they spiraled into philosophical confusion. Some began conducting dramatic monologues to their security cameras. Others argued with mannequins they'd named after former co-workers. One particularly intense prepper staged fake court trials against squirrels who trespassed into his greenhouse. The squirrels won every time. And finally, the blissfully unaware. These were the people who had simply missed the memo. Perhaps they'd been on silent meditation retreats or extremely deep scuba diving trips. One man in New Zealand had lived off the grid for so long, he thought the virus was just a new kind of reality show. Survivor, Earth Edition, he called it, and then went back to carving spoons. What united all 3 groups was a strange, lingering sense of disbelief. Not the dramatic kind found in dystopian novels, but the slow-burning, nagging kind. Like waking up every day in a world that feels off by just 1 pixel. Something's missing, but you can't quite articulate what. Is it traffic? Is it casual eavesdropping in cafes? Is it pretending to care about PowerPoint presentations? And yet, as absurd as it seemed, life continued. Gardens were planted in parking lots. Solar panels were salvaged from roofs by people who once couldn't change a light bulb. Libraries became bunkhouses, grocery stores became town halls, and in one particularly avant-garde case, a Chuck E. Cheese was transformed into a place of worship. The animatronic rat was declared a prophet, and its sermons, delivered via malfunctioning audio loop, were considered deeply symbolic, or just deeply unsettling. Of course, not everyone adapted gracefully. Some fell into rituals just to create the illusion of purpose. They made calendars out of sticks, chore wheels out of old frisbees, and wrote passive-aggressive notes to themselves about leaving dishes unwashed. Loneliness, after all, is easiest to ignore when you have structure, even if that structure includes formally scheduling time to sob quietly into a bucket. And amid this quiet chaos, a new kind of storytelling emerged. Without the internet, survivors told tales aloud. Around fires, under tarps, in echoing department stores, legends were born. Not of dragons or gods, but of Chad from accounting, who once outran a bear by throwing Slim Jims behind him like a deranged trail mix Hansel. Stories got stranger by the day. Reality blurred with fiction, but no one minded. Who was going to fact-check? Wikipedia hadn't been updated in months. In these tales, the virus became almost mythical. It wasn't just a pathogen. It was the silence, the great wipe, the vanishing. Some said it had a face. Others said it whispered your name before it took you. Children born after the collapse would one day hear these stories and wonder if such a thing could ever truly happen. Their parents would nod grimly, then go back to using a tennis racket as a spatula. So humanity stumbled forward, not heroically, not tragically, but chaotically, like it always had. There was a strange intimacy in being one of the last people alive. With the noise of civilization stripped away, every heartbeat felt like an ancient drum, echoing in a world too big for its inhabitants. You could stand in the middle of a 6-lane freeway with your arms outstretched, scream into the emptiness, and no one would tell you to keep it down. No deadlines, no emails, just the existential weight of complete freedom and far too much canned soup. But even freedom grows heavy without friction. You need something to push against, something to resist. In a world emptied of obligations, rules, and social niceties, people began inventing their own nonsense to fill the void. Arguments broke out over the proper way to pronounce quinoa. Duels were staged over disputes as petty as who got to use the last roll of toilet paper someone found behind a vending machine. It turned out that even with 90% fewer people, humanity could still find ways to be petty. That's when the philosophical camps began to appear. Not communities, ideologies. Makeshift belief systems born from boredom, loneliness, and whatever half-remembered college course someone once took before the collapse. There were the reversionists, who believed technology had caused the fall and that salvation lay in returning to a pre-electric, pre-industrial way of life. These were the folks you'd find rubbing sticks together to light fires, even while a perfectly good lighter sat in their cargo pants. Opposite them were the accelerationists, who claimed the virus was just the first step in a cosmic evolution. They hacked abandoned tech, rebuilt drones from scrap, and spoke in cryptic phrases like conscious singularity and bio-quantum elevation, which mostly meant they watched too much science fiction and now thought toaster ovens had souls. Then there were the radicals of ritual. They weren't religious in the traditional sense, but they treated routines like sacred rites. Every morning they bowed to a still-functioning vending machine in the lobby of a former Marriott and whispered prayers to the god of carbonated beverages. Every third Tuesday, they reenacted the before times by holding a fake corporate meeting, complete with a whiteboard that read synergy goals and a ceremonial PowerPoint presentation about nothing at all. But among all these absurd factions, one group stood out, the realists. They didn't care about ideology, progress, or cosmic elevation. They just wanted to make it to Friday. They formed loose networks across regions, trading useful information instead of beliefs. Where to find clean water, which supermarket freezers had thawed and refrozen food, how to grow tomatoes without accidentally poisoning yourself with unfamiliar weeds. Their motto wasn't profound. It was survive, then maybe laugh about it later. Still, even the realists weren't immune to madness. One of their communities, based in an old bowling alley in rural Oregon, held an annual event called the Ball of Hope, where everyone dressed in whatever formal wear they could scavenge, often a mix of bathrobes and prom dresses, and danced to a wind-up gramophone until the needle wore out. It wasn't logical. It wasn't practical. But it reminded them they were still human. Because that was the strange paradox of post-collapse life. Everything mattered more, and yet nothing mattered at all. A smile from a stranger was a rare and cherished currency. A hot meal was a miracle. A working toilet, practically royalty-level luxury. But at the same time, all the old goals, careers, status, social media likes, had evaporated. What replaced them wasn't clarity or enlightenment, but an uncomfortable rawness. There was nothing left to hide behind. Some survivors began journaling obsessively, convinced someone, someday, would want to know what it was like. Most entries went something like this. Day 127. 8 canned peaches. Saw a raccoon wearing a Burger King crown. Unsure if it was real. We'll name him Charles anyway. Meanwhile, children born after the collapse saw the world through utterly different eyes. They didn't mourn the loss of phones, or malls, or air conditioning. They mourned the fact that no one knew how to build a working swing set. They drew pictures of strange beasts, part bear, part drone, that only existed in their dreams. They played games with rules so fluid they made Calvin Ball look rigid. And perhaps, in their chaos, they were the freest of all. And through it all, nature kept reclaiming. Trees punched through sidewalks. Ivy strangled old office parks. In one memorable moment, a survivor in Milan climbed the roof of a bank to find a family of goats perched smugly like they had just taken over the financial sector. Which, honestly, would have been an improvement. Yes, the world was quieter, but it wasn't dead. It had just changed frequencies. And if you listened closely, you could hear the new rhythm. It wasn't the hum of traffic or the buzz of cities. It was the rustle of wind through abandoned clotheslines. The laughter of 3 kids discovering fireflies. The sound of someone singing to themselves in a gutted supermarket aisle because, well, why not? And maybe that's what surviving truly looked like. Finding new meaning in the absurd, dancing in the ruins, and telling stories so future generations might remember not what was lost, but what it meant to still be here. It began, as most bizarre forms of governance do, with a game of rock, paper, scissors. In the ruins of what used to be a Walmart garden center, 5 ragged strangers, none of whom had ever met before, stood in a loose circle surrounded by plastic flamingos, expired seed packets, and a half-burned banner that once read "Spring is here." One of them, a former civil servant named Janet, suggested they needed rules. The others scoffed until a rogue band of raccoons stole their only remaining stockpile of granola bars, and suddenly leadership didn't seem so unnecessary. And so the Council of Randomly Elected Strangers was born. The only qualification to join? Be present. No campaigning, no voting, just show up and don't smell too much like mold. Every decision, from resource distribution to punishment for hoarding batteries, was made through a rotating system of games. One week it was charades. Another, it was Settlers of Catan. They once decided to exile a member after he lost 3 consecutive rounds of Uno. Though, to be fair, he had been hiding wild draw 4s in his sock. The council met every Thursday in the husk of a Chuck E. Cheese, seated around a booth reinforced with scrap metal and crowned with a deflated animatronic mouse head that now served as a ceremonial speaking hat. Whoever wore the mouse got to talk. Whoever didn't had to mind their objections. The system was absurd, but, much to everyone's surprise, it sort of worked. And across the globe, similar governments began to form. In the ruins of Tokyo, a faction calling themselves the Bento Bloc organized entirely around shared lunches and karaoke-based conflict resolution. In Cape Town, a group of former theater students declared themselves the Ministry of Vibes and governed through interpretive dance. Paris, being Paris, simply refused to acknowledge the collapse at all and continued living as if nothing had happened, sipping wine beside the Seine while occasionally muttering "Mon Dieu" at feral dogs and berets. But while each new society embraced its own brand of chaos, one question echoed across every makeshift campfire and abandoned radio station. How do we avoid doing it all again? Because despite all the jokes, all the dance rituals, all the raccoon-related trauma, there was an underlying terror none of the survivors could quite name. The virus hadn't just killed, it had exposed. It laid bare the fragility of everything people had once trusted: governments, healthcare systems, global supply chains. With a sneeze, it had toppled the illusion of permanence. And now, with 9 out of 10 humans gone, the survivors stood ankle-deep in ash and had to ask, if we rebuild, will we repeat? Some said no, that humans would learn. That without the burden of population pressure and economic greed, the new world could be gentler, more equitable. Others weren't so optimistic. They pointed to the fact that within weeks, multiple settlements had already created currencies using bottle caps, chewing gum, or in one disturbing case, toe bones. Apparently, scarcity made even the weirdest things valuable again. But perhaps the most curious experiment emerged in what used to be Saskatchewan. A group of philosophy majors, who were shocked to find themselves still alive, and even more shocked to find anyone caring about their opinions, decided to create a society based entirely on moral relativism. No laws, just discussions. Everything from food rations to murder was up for debate, which worked right up until someone actually committed murder. The ensuing argument lasted 6 days, during which the body was repurposed into fertilizer as part of a compassionate recycling initiative. Meanwhile, former billionaires, those who had survived, found themselves in awkward positions. With no stock market, no private jets, and no internet, their influence evaporated faster than an influencer's follower count during a scandal. One man, once CEO of a trillion-dollar tech empire, now worked as the community's designated goat herder. His goats were happier than his shareholders had ever been. Some tried to restore the old ways. They rebuilt conference rooms out of broken drywall, held earnings calls over tin-can telephones, and created PowerPoint presentations using charcoal on bedsheets. But without an economy to fuel their delusions, their meetings quickly devolved into therapy sessions. One former hedge fund manager admitted he'd never really understood derivatives. Another confessed that his job title, innovation evangelist, had never meant anything. Yet through all this chaos, something resembling balance began to emerge. People bartered, shared, adapted. There were setbacks, of course, disease, infighting, rogue bands of feral gym bros. But there was also cooperation. A farmer in Chile sent seeds via pigeon to a settlement in Morocco. A mechanic in Ohio fixed a shortwave radio and broadcast bedtime stories to anyone who could hear. Children who had never known the old world began to play games that didn't involve screens or scores, just imagination and a good stick. The virus had wiped out humanity's numbers, but not its humor. Not its ability to improvise, to find joy in small things, to build strange governments and stranger traditions. Some said it was madness. Others called it the greatest comeback in theatrical history. Deep within the shell of a crumbling New York City, nestled between what used to be 8th Avenue and a surprisingly well-preserved Dunkin' Donuts, stood the last bastion of high culture in a world that had largely forgotten how to spell culture. The Metropolitan Opera House, once the proud home of aria-loving elites, had been reclaimed not by performers or patrons, but by a one-eyed Romanian director named Lazar Vlad. Lazar had once staged controversial operas involving taxidermied deer and underwater choirs. He was, as he put it, misunderstood in peacetime, essential in chaos. When the virus swept the globe, he took refuge in the dressing rooms beneath the opera house, surviving on complimentary mints and a truly baffling number of forgotten champagne bottles. When the dust began to settle, Lazar emerged, wrapped in a velvet curtain, and declared, "We shall perform Macbeth with puppets and stray cats." No one knows where he got the cats. Some believe they followed him out of respect. Others suspect he trained them using sardines and interpretive dance. But one thing was clear. Every Friday, survivors from the outer boroughs would gather in the once opulent ruins to watch Lady Macbeth purr, mewl, and occasionally swipe at the cardboard scenery. The cast included a tuxedo tomcat as Banquo, a pair of tabbies as the witches, and a particularly moody SBHYNX named Mephisto as Macbeth himself. The audience, starved not only of food but of meaning, lapped it up. And not just because the popcorn substitute was dried beet chips mixed with crickets. For many, this feline Shakespearean tragedy offered something the world had been lacking long before the virus: catharsis. In a universe gone absurd, watching a cat dramatically leap off a balcony during the final act somehow made more sense than anything the old news anchors used to say. Art was back, not in curated galleries or chic underground clubs, but in alleyways, burned-out buses, and repurposed car parks. In Brazil, a group of survivors recreated the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe using sock puppets and 2 plastic forks. In Mongolia, ex-nomads wrote epic poems about the fall of capitalism and sang them over yak bone drums. And in suburban Australia, a retired accountant taught teens to paint using crushed flower petals and repurposed mayonnaise jars. The need to express, to create, to make something beautiful or ridiculous or both, it endured. Even among ruins, humans built meaning. Not always wisely. In some places, they built cults. One group, calling themselves the Preserved, believed the virus had been divine punishment for microwave dinners and devoted themselves to raw food-only living. Their leader, a charismatic former chef with a god complex and a man bun, insisted everyone ferment their own emotions. In another settlement, a band of ex-YouTubers tried to restart the influencer economy using charcoal portraits and cave walls. Followers were determined by how many people showed up to watch them brush their teeth. One woman made a name for herself live painting her dreams. Another achieved minor fame by reviewing different kinds of moss. She called herself the Greenfluencer. And yes, despite the population drop, clout chasing still existed. Humanity, it seems, would rather die than let go of the desire to be liked by strangers. Even if those strangers were just two confused raccoons and a man named Steve who only spoke in haikus. Yet through all the performance and posturing, there were glimmers of something genuine. A child in Nairobi who built a musical instrument from scrap metal and rain gutters played it at dusk, and it echoed through abandoned buildings like a lullaby to a broken world. A man in Iceland painted murals of those lost, turning crumbling walls into memorials more sacred than any cathedral. In Kazakhstan, an elderly woman told bedtime stories to whoever would listen, each tale laced with wisdom that somehow survived the burning of libraries. It wasn't about reviving the past. That world was gone. It was about stitching together a new story, one chorus at a time. Music without studios. Art without critics. Theater with meowing soliloquies and audience members who sometimes brought fish in appreciation. It was weird, chaotic, a bit feral, but undeniably human. Of course, not everyone saw this cultural renaissance as hopeful. In the Arctic, a hyper-rationalist colony of engineers called the Algorithm dismissed all artistic expression as inefficient. They attempted to outlaw metaphor, sarcasm, and color palettes with more than 3 shades. Their attempt to design a universally acceptable symphony using math failed when it induced seizures in 12% of listeners and violent rage in the rest. Still, the algorithmists marched on, convinced that emotion was the virus and logic the cure. The rest of humanity mostly ignored them, or sent them anonymous haikus just to mess with their data models. As society clawed its way out of the ashes, it became clear that survival wasn't just about food, water, and shelter. It was about storytelling, about laughter in the dark, music in the silence, absurdity in the face of annihilation. Culture, for all its fluff and fragility, was proving itself the backbone of resilience. Next, we'll dive into the rebuilding of education, how former janitors became professors, math was replaced with practical wizardry, and history class became a mix of scavenger hunt and gossip. Because when there are no textbooks left, you make do with old graffiti and survivors with excellent memories. Education had always been a pillar of civilization, but when civilization imploded, the pillars didn't crumble so much as they shrugged and wandered off into the forest to become yoga instructors. With schools abandoned, libraries looted, and digital archives wiped out in one glorious electromagnetic hiss during the Great Solar Flare incident, a delightful subplot in humanity's demise. Humanity faced a sobering truth. No one remembered how anything worked. The children, wild-eyed and half-feral, could recite TikTok dances from muscle memory but couldn't spell the word oxygen. Meanwhile, adults argued about whether an egg cooked better on a rock or on a car hood under the sun, which was now noticeably hotter thanks to a little climate spice added to the viral apocalypse. In short, education needed a reboot, and fast. That reboot came not from elite academics or surviving tech billionaires, most of whom had tried to upload their consciousness into smart fridges and failed spectacularly, but from unlikely heroes. Janitors, librarians, retired trivia champions, and one extremely patient woman named Bernadette who had memorized all 7 Harry Potter books and recited them nightly to any child who would listen. Hogwarts had become Harvard. Former janitors, it turned out, knew how buildings worked. Plumbing, ventilation, what not to touch when it's hissing. They became the new professors of applied survival infrastructure. Their classrooms were empty warehouses or theater basements, and their chalkboards were repurposed stop signs. Instead of grades, students earned beans, matches, or the rare and precious commodity of dental floss. Librarians, oh, bless their cardigan-clad souls, became sages. Those who had once shushed hormonal teenagers in hushed corners now stood as guardians of fragmented knowledge. They kept lists of the last remaining books, most of which were cookbooks, romance novels, and a disturbingly large number of Dan Brown thrillers. But they adapted. The Da Vinci Code was now required reading for logic training. 50 Shades of Grey was used to teach metaphor, shame, and negotiation tactics. Math was no longer theoretical. If you wanted to learn algebra, you had to barter for it. Calculus? That cost a potato and a good story. Geometry was still around, primarily used by carpenters and rogue architects trying to rebuild tree houses for post-apocalyptic Airbnb ventures. Meanwhile, chemistry had returned to its roots, blowing things up in a vaguely controlled manner. History was the real Wild West. With no reliable databases, historical knowledge now came from oral storytelling, graffiti, scraps of old newspapers, and one guy named Marvin who claimed to have watched every episode of Jeopardy before the collapse. Was he accurate? Not really, but he wore a hat that said, "I know stuff." And in this new world, confidence was 80% credibility. A new kind of schooling emerged. It was called learning by not dying. You learn not to touch glowing mushrooms, not to drink water that smelled like irony disappointment, not to accept gifts from tribes that smiled too much. These lessons were passed down through cautionary tales and illustrated murals featuring stick figures in various stages of electrocution. Curriculums were fluid, usually depending on what the teachers remembered from the old world. One particularly ambitious collective in what used to be Oregon started a school of bardic engineering. Their motto was "Sing it, build it, survive." Students learned to craft working pulley systems while rapping the periodic table. Graduation involved constructing a trebuchet while reciting the Iliad backwards. Exams were, well, let's call them stress simulations. For example, you might be blindfolded and tasked with identifying edible plants while being chased by a goose trained to attack the scent of fear. Pass, and you'd receive a certificate written on flattened soup cans. Fail, and you'd be featured in the next cautionary fable. Teachers were respected, sometimes worshipped, occasionally sacrificed, usually just symbolically, unless someone really messed up a weather prediction. In some enclaves, education was gamified. Survivors earned knowledge points for feats like solving water filtration problems, deconstructing enemy propaganda, or remembering the lyrics to a Britney Spears song in its entirety. This last one, oddly, saved lives. Her music was discovered to repel certain mutated squirrels. Science was weird now. Of course, not all learning was noble. Black market universities popped up. They taught lockpicking, psychological manipulation, and DIY poisons. Tuition was usually paid in blood, booze, or batteries. But even in these shady corners, education thrived. Because if the world taught humanity anything, it was that ignorance kills faster than any virus. By this point, children born after the collapse, called Virakids, viewed the old education system as myth. Desks in rows, multiple choice tests? They laughed. Their learning involved growing food, navigating by stars, and deciphering the motivations of adult survivors who smiled too much and offered mysterious projects. Group work was now a survival drill. Some communities even attempted universities. The University of New Appalachia specialized in herbal medicine, storytelling theory, and post-industrial ethics. Their mascot was a giant owl made from toaster parts, and their motto was, "Do no harm, unless it's hilarious." Rival institutions sprang up, the University of Reboot, the College of Resilience, and one boot camp called Hard Knock Life that took the name far too literally. Knowledge was becoming sacred again, not because it led to wealth or degrees or bragging rights at cocktail parties. Those were now soup parties. But because it was life. Knowing how to make soap, how to read weather patterns, how to spot a liar by their nostril flares, these things mattered. And for once, learning wasn't about passing tests. It was about passing stories. Coming up next, we'll explore how communication evolved in the post-virus world. What happened when the internet finally died, language fractured, and emoji hieroglyphs became official dialects. Also, the dramatic rise of carrier pigeons and interpretive dance as diplomatic tools. Yes, humanity always finds a way, even if it's through flapping wings and jazz hands. When the internet finally gasped its last electric breath, humanity stood in stunned silence, not out of reverence, but because no one could remember how to communicate without a GIF. Gone were the days of instant messaging, passive-aggressive Slack threads, and viral videos of cats playing piano. The digital Babel collapsed, and what replaced it was, honestly, a fever dream of symbols, squeaks, and wildly interpretive gestures. Welcome to the new age of communication, brought to you by desperation, duct tape, and way too much time alone. First came the Great Silence. That eerie period when phones buzzed no more, screens went dark, and millions tried to reboot their routers as if stroking them gently might awaken some dormant Wi-Fi deity. When it became clear the cloud had burst into digital oblivion, people were forced to make eye contact. This, understandably, caused mass panic. Emojis were replaced by real facial expressions, an unsettling concept for those raised on memes and filters. Without social media, the public square reverted to its primal form, actual squares. Town centers filled with chalk-drawn messages, wooden boards pinned with notes, and messengers yelling news in dramatic accents just for flair. It was all very Shakespearean until someone got punched for using iambic pentameter during a grocery shortage announcement. Language, like bread, became stale and then wildly reinvented. Without spellcheck or grammar policing, dialects mutated rapidly. In the former Midwest, English fused with regional slang and pantry inventory lists. Aight y'all, corn be low, beans be poppin', meet at barn o'clock became perfectly reasonable syntax. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, survivors adopted a minimalist dialect consisting solely of weather descriptions and facial hair critiques. The emoji, stripped from keyboards, was reborn in the physical world, painted on walls, scratched into tree bark, and even tattooed on foreheads for those committed to self-expression and poor decisions. These symbols carried emotion when words fell short. A red heart on a door meant safe house. A poop emoji spray painted on a wagon? That was self-explanatory. Communication also went mobile, retro-mobile. Carrier pigeons, once laughed at in history books, made a triumphant comeback. The skies fluttered with birds bearing messages, love notes, or, occasionally, passive-aggressive shopping lists. One romantic soul sent a pigeon to propose marriage. The pigeon delivered the message to the wrong person, who accepted. The original sender was too polite to correct it. That's how marriages work now. Drums returned. Smoke signals returned. People trained parrots to recite weather updates. There were town criers with bells, interpretive dancers used as diplomats, and one woman named Sheila who became the world's last known Morse code expert. And she absolutely abused her power by sending cryptic threats to rival villages. But communication wasn't just about logistics. It was about rebuilding trust. After the pandemic, paranoia reigned. Was this person truly who they said they were? Could they be infected, deranged, or worse, an influencer? New rituals emerged. Instead of shaking hands, people exchanged riddles. If you could solve it, you were deemed intellectually trustworthy. If you failed, you were either banished or made to perform stand-up comedy as penance. Eventually, regions developed official communication protocols. The Republic of Cascadia favored wind chimes for announcements. The Neo-Texan Confederation used smoke grenades in varying colors to signal everything from free barbecue to incoming tornado, grab the dogs. In the New Sahara Collective, sand drawings were the preferred medium, though the occasional gust of wind made most conversations tragically ephemeral. One major issue was long-distance diplomacy. With no internet and no working satellites, they were all crashing into each other like drunken geese. Interregional communication needed creativity. Enter the Bardic Express. These were individuals trained to memorize entire diplomatic dialogues and deliver them theatrically, often with props and emotional outbursts. Some took liberties. One envoy turned a request for trade negotiations into a 3-act musical. It received standing ovations, but no grain. Of course, misunderstandings flourished. One village misinterpreted a hand-drawn map as a threat, went to war, and later discovered it was a recipe for sourdough. In another case, a love letter delivered by Raven was read aloud during a funeral by mistake, leading to one of the most awkward and strangely romantic alliances in post-apocalyptic history. Despite all this chaos, the beauty of the human spirit shone through. People wanted to be heard. They needed connection. So they sang, they danced, they shouted from rooftops and etched stories into cave walls. Children invented whistling languages, adults carved their feelings into driftwood, and somewhere in the ruins of Paris, an elderly mime rebuilt society one imaginary brick at a time. Eventually, archivists began documenting these new forms. The lexicon of post-viral languages included sections on pidgin phraseology, gesture grammatics, and oops, all symbols, a guide to interpreting carved emojis found in wild shelters. Linguists who once debated Oxford commas now risked life and limb to record an evolving dialect spoken only by survivors in former Vegas, who communicated entirely through dice rolls and dramatic shrugs. In next part, we'll step into the quiet aftermath of humanity's near extinction and ask the only question that really matters. If 90% of us vanished, what does it truly mean to be part of the 10% left behind? And perhaps more pressingly, does surviving make you noble? Or just lucky? Or worse, boring? Let's find out. There's an eerie stillness in a world emptied of its noisemakers. The highways are silent, save for the whisper of wind through cracked glass. Skyscrapers cast shadows over empty intersections like forgotten gods watching over extinct worshippers. And in this ghostly silence, the survivors learned something profoundly uncomfortable. They were not chosen. They were just left. In a world where 90% of humanity vanished, some in hospitals, others in living rooms, a few mid-sentence in bustling cafes, the remaining 10% quickly abandoned the delusion that survival implied purpose. No higher power was orchestrating this. No divine hand had spared them for greatness. They were, as one survivor muttered while frying rat meat over a trash fire, the lucky ones, or the unlucky ones, depending on your rent situation. This truth hit harder than the virus itself. Because what happens when there's no one left to impress, no meetings to be late for, no Instagram to cure it, no crushing social pressure to pretend you're fine. People didn't just lose neighbors or co-workers. They lost the invisible scaffolding that held their identities together. Some mourned civilization. Others danced on its grave. Libraries were looted, not for books, but for chairs, very comfortable chairs. The Louvre was repurposed as a greenhouse. Bitcoin became completely worthless, except in the new Andes collective where it was used as fire starter. One eccentric group declared a flat tax on oxygen and were immediately ignored into irrelevance. But slowly, painfully, humanity began reinventing itself, not as a global empire, but as scattered villages of weird, stubborn misfits. And this time, with fewer PowerPoint presentations and far more communal singing, the remnants began asking the big questions again. Not the ones on philosophy podcasts no one listened to before the collapse, but real ones. Do we rebuild cities or let nature reclaim them? Do we create laws or trust the village baker to also be the sheriff? Is monogamy still a thing, or do we just try whatever until it feels less weird? Who gets to write the history books this time? And will they be illustrated with stick figures or charcoal cave murals? Of course, religion surged, some old, some new. In Tasmania, a sect worshipped the last known vending machine. In Finland, a movement emerged around a solar-powered Roomba that survived the entire collapse and continued cleaning a perfectly empty lobby for 3 years without complaint. They called it the Humble One. Technology didn't vanish. It evolved. Instead of corporations, engineers worked for communities. Instead of branding, there were barter systems. No one missed corporate mission statements. No one wrote quarterly reports. The only KPI was, did you feed the chickens? And if not, well, good luck explaining yourself at dinner. Children born after the virus grew up in a strange paradise. No standard tests, no malls, no celebrity gossip. Their heroes were seed savers, rainwater harvesters, and people who could start a fire without yelling, "It's not working." Their games involved actual risk, like building rafts or exploring ruins. Their imaginations weren't boxed in by screen time. They had the whole haunted earth to roam. Ironically, art thrived. With no content algorithms to please, creators got weird again. Puppet theater returned. Poetry became currency. One man wrote a 700-page novel using only fruit labels and twine. It was awful, but people loved it because at least it wasn't a reboot of a reboot. Even comedy survived. Oh, it flourished. With tragedy behind them and nothing to lose, humor became humanity's last rebellion. Jokes about the virus were tasteless and relentless. Sarcasm was a coping mechanism. One widely celebrated clown toured former megacities with a show titled The Last Laugh, featuring interpretive coughing and slapstick pee-pee removal. Critics called it deeply offensive and utterly healing. But most important of all, people began to feel human again. Not brands, not usernames, just people. They laughed without emojis, cried without filters, argued over real bread, not political opinions halfway read on a headline. They danced because music echoed in their bones, not from earbuds. And they remembered that life, stripped of spectacle, still had taste, even if that taste was moss and regret. Now, dear listener, here's the kicker. If 90% of humanity vanished and the world didn't end, maybe the world never needed us in such bloated numbers to begin with. Maybe we weren't the main characters in Earth's story, just noisy extras. And maybe, just maybe, the apocalypse was less of an end and more of an unscheduled sabbatical. So what would you do if the virus didn't get you? Would you hoard canned beans and call it a strategy? Would you lead a utopia or ruin it with bureaucracy in 3 weeks flat? Would you miss rush hour traffic or quietly admit it was never worth the commute? You're listening to What If Horizons, where we take the end of the world and ask if it was really so bad. If you enjoyed spiraling into global catastrophe with a chuckle, don't forget to follow, leave a review, and share this with the 10% of your friends still emotionally available. Or the one guy with the Roomba religion. He probably needs a laugh. See you in the next episode, if the pigeons deliver the script in time.